Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Vice President of the United States and the Chair of the National Space Council, Mike Pence.
Well, thank you all. To Governor Ivey, Secretary Ross, Secretary Chao, Secretary Wilson, to NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, to all the members of the National Space Council and the User Advisory Group, to Dr. Deborah Barnhart and the great team here at the Space and Rocket Center, honored guests, and especially to all the dedicated men and women of the Marshall Space Flight Center. It is great to be back in Rocket City. Thank you for joining us for this 5th meeting of the National Space Council at an enormously important time in American leadership in space. And while you're at it, join me in thanking our hosts today, the men and women of the United States Space and Rocket Center, who keep the great tradition, past, present, and future of American space leadership alive every day. And speaking of space enthusiasts, allow me to bring greetings from a friend of mine and a man who is committed to securing American leadership here on Earth and in the boundless expanse of space. I bring greetings from the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump. No, the United States has always been a nation of restless pioneers, ever striving to explore uncharted territories, reach new horizons, and venture into the unknown to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. And as President Trump has said, in his words, it is America's destiny to be the leader amongst nations on our own adventure into the great unknown. And over the past 2 years, we've begun writing the next great chapter of that adventure with American ingenuity and American industry. And you know, it's especially fitting to gather here in Rocket City as we prepare to celebrate later this year the golden anniversary of the Apollo 11 mission, which carried the first men to the moon and was powered by rockets developed right here in Huntsville, Alabama. And as we approach that anniversary, I can tell you, it's a special honor and a privilege for us to be joined in this effort by one of those 2 courageous astronauts whose lunar module set down on the Sea of Tranquility. Ladies and gentlemen, would you mind getting on your feet and helping me to welcome and thank Apollo 11 astronaut Buzz Aldrin for a lifetime of service and heroism. "50 years ago, one small step for man became one giant leap for mankind. But now's come the time for us to make the next giant leap and return American astronauts to the moon, establish a permanent base there, and develop the technologies to take American astronauts to Mars and beyond. That's the next giant leap. And as we'll hear today from these members of the National Space Council and our distinguished panelists, under the leadership of President Trump and with the strong support of NASA's 13th administrator, we've made great progress toward renewing America's proud legacy of leadership in space. We've been updating out-of-date regulations to unleash America's pioneering space companies and forge the technologies to blaze new trails into space and create American jobs for the future. We've been implementing the first ever policy of space traffic management to enable commercial enterprise and protect our nation's asset in the congested orbital environment. And to meet the growing security threats in the warfighting domain of space at the direction of our Commander-in-Chief, this year, working with the Congress, we will establish the 6th branch of our armed forces, the United States Space Force. In fact, I'm proud to share with all of you that the President has announced his nominee to lead the new Unified Combatant Command, the United States Space Command, today. 4-star Air Force General John Raymond will lead U.S. Space Command. And while we're mentioning people that we admire, I know she'll soon be returning to the academic world, but let me take this moment to thank Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson for her tireless work and the historic role she has played in helping the Air Force launch the United States Space Force. Thank you, Heather, for your service to the nation. Today we stand at the dawn of a new era of space exploration, an era that will bring untold new challenges and opportunities. And it will demand the best of us. It will demand new ideas, renewed energies, courage, and bold action. After spending more than 45 years in low Earth orbit, President Trump and our entire administration believe that it is time to push onward to new horizons and new destinations. And that's why, under the President's leadership, we've taken decisive action to propel human space exploration missions further into the depths of our solar system, and we've unleashed America's private pioneers to cultivate the vast expanses of low Earth orbit. Last year, NASA and American innovators began designing the precursor to outposts on the Moon and the mission to Mars, the Lunar Gateway. And we are rallying the world to join us in this vital work. This month, Canada became our first international partner and announced a 24-year commitment to cooperate on the Lunar Gateway. And as we speak, we're working with Congress to provide $500 million to get an American crew aboard this lunar orbiting platform in the coming years. We've also made great progress on the commercial crew program. This month, the Crew Dragon's successful mission was the first time since the last space shuttle flight in 2011 that we launched an American rocket from American soil designed to send humans to space orbit. And as President Trump said not long ago, before the year is out, American astronauts will go back to space on American rockets. You know, I had the chance to talk to one of the Americans who was aboard the International Space Station when the Crew Dragon docked there. She's an American patriot, a combat veteran, United States Army aviator who recently traded her Army uniform for an American spacesuit, Anne McClain. Today, we're honored to be joined by two other pioneers of spaceflight who helped blaze the trail for Anne and for every young American who dreams of one day leading her nation in space. So join me in thanking these American heroes for their service and leadership, Colonel Eileen Collins and Dr. Sandy Magnus. These are two great American heroes. So we've made great strides in advancing the President's bold new vision for space, a vision to push our nation farther and faster than ever. And unlike the last few administrations, we've had the budgets to match it. In fact, with the strong support of leaders in Congress like the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Alabama's own Senator Richard Shelby, The President has already signed into law the largest NASA budget since the days of the Apollo program, and we fully funded the Space Launch System and the Orion space capsule. And of course, in December of 2017, the President signed Space Policy Directive 1 to return Americans to the moon and prioritize crewed missions to the lunar surface. SPD-1, as it's come to be known, marked a watershed moment for America's space enterprise since the disastrous decision to cancel the Constellation program in 2010. The truth is, NASA's exploration efforts were left adrift with no clear direction, focus, or mission. To your credit, the men and women of the Marshall Space Flight Center never gave up. You persevered with distinction through a time of indecision at the highest levels of our national government, and you continued to do your best, which is to build the greatest and most powerful rockets ever known to man. Give yourselves a round of applause for persevering here at Marshall and developing the rockets of the future. With Space Policy Directive 1, President Trump finally gave NASA the clear direction and clear mission that it needs. And as President Trump said, we will return American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972 for long-term exploration and use. And as he said, not only to, quote, plant our flag and leave our footprints, but to establish a foundation on the moon for an eventual mission to Mars. Now, over the past 2 years, I've had the privilege to travel across this country and meet with many of NASA's more than 18,000 scientists, engineers, astronauts, and contract officers. Everywhere I go, I see renewed energy and excitement. The President's commitment to American leadership in space is inspiring. But to achieve our objectives, I came here today to say that NASA must meet that new spirit with new urgency and the focus that it all deserves. Just a few moments ago, Buzz Aldrin was reflecting on his time in the Apollo program. He talked about that fabled Apollo 11 mission. He said in 1962, we had an objective, we had time, but we didn't have a plan. In Space Policy Directive 1, the President directed NASA to create a lunar exploration plan. But as of today, more than 15 months later, we still don't have a plan in place, but Administrator Bridenstiner told me 5 minutes ago, we now have a plan to return to the moon. Truth is, despite the dedication of the men and women who are designing and building and testing the SLS, you all know the program's been plagued by bureaucratic inertia, by what some call the paralysis of analysis. The nation actually learned with great disappointment in recent weeks that the date for the first flight for the SLS has been pushed back yet again to 2021. You know, after years of cost overruns and slipped deadlines, we're actually being told that the earliest we can get back to the moon is 2028. Now, that would be 18 years after the SLS program was started, and 11 years after the President of the United States directed NASA to return American astronauts to the moon. Ladies and gentlemen, that's just not good enough. We're better than that. It took us 8 years to get to the moon the first time, 50 years ago, when we had never done it before. And it shouldn't take us 11 years to get back. You know, it's been 47 years since American astronauts last walked on the moon. And ironically, America's first generation of space pioneers knew that it would likely take time for the next generation to return to the moon, including one of the founders of Rocket City, Dr. Wernher von Braun. Just as it took the development of the airplane for the United States Navy to reach the South Pole 45 years after an expedition of Norwegian explorers made history and got there in 1911. Dr. von Braun believed it would take what he called, in his words, enabling technology for us to return to the lunar surface, and that it might take just as much time to develop it. The good news is, as we will hear from our distinguished panelists today, those enabling technologies have arrived, and we are going back to the moon. Because of your work, because of the ingenuity, dedication, and entrepreneurial spirit reflected in this room and throughout the American space enterprise, since the end of Apollo 11, we've forged incredible breakthroughs in our technology that have allowed us to go further, more safely in space than ever before. We have the technology to return to the moon and renew American leadership in human space exploration. What we need now is urgency. Now, make no mistake about it. We're in a space race today, just as we were in the 1960s. And the stakes are even higher. Last December, China became the first nation to land on the far side of the moon and revealed their ambition to seize the lunar strategic high ground and become the world's preeminent spacefaring nation. And for more than 7 years, without a viable human space launch program of our own, Russia has been charging the United States more than $80 million a seat every time an American astronaut travels to the International Space Station. But it's not just competition against our adversaries. We're also racing against our worst enemy, complacency. And the truth is, we've been here before. Nearly 62 years ago, the race for space began, and the Soviet Union took an early lead. But the sight of Sputnik blinking across the October sky spurred the American people to action. We refused to accept a future in space written by the enemies of freedom. We vowed to claim our rightful place as the undisputed leader in the exploration of the heavens, and 12 years later, the one giant leap occurred. We achieved our goal of American leadership in space. Now, more than 50 years later, we gather here today to say that it's up to this generation to meet the challenge of our time. And with the recommendations of this National Space Council, the recommendations will be approved today. I believe that we are rising to meet that challenge head on. Just as the United States was the first nation to reach the moon in the 20th century, so too will we be the first nation to return astronauts to the moon in the 21st century. And I'm here on the President's behalf to tell the men and women of the Marshall Space Flight Center and the American people that at the direction of the President of the United States, it is the stated policy of this administration and the United States of America to return American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years. And let me be clear. The first woman and the next man on the moon will both be American astronauts, launched by American rockets from American soil. But to accomplish this, we must redouble our efforts here in Huntsville and throughout this program. We must accelerate the SLS program to meet this objective. But know this: the President has directed NASA and Administrator Jim Bridenstine to accomplish this goal by any means necessary. In order to succeed, as the Administrator will discuss today, we must focus on the mission over the means. You must consider every available option and platform to meet our goals, including industry, government, and the entire American space enterprise. Our administration is committed to this goal, and this President, this administration, and the American people are committed to achieving that goal at the Marshall Space Flight Center. The truth is, we're committed to Marshall, the incredible history that you have here. But to be clear, we're not committed to any one contractor. If our current contractors can't meet this objective, then we'll find ones that will. If American industry can provide critical commercial services without government development, then we'll buy them. And if commercial rockets are the only way to get American astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, then commercial rockets it will be. Urgency must be our watchword. Failure to achieve our goal, to return an American astronaut to the moon in the next 5 years, it's not an option. As we will discuss today, this will require renewed focus and a relentless will to achieve our mission. And that's exactly what you have in abundance here in northern Alabama. You know, urgency has always been in the DNA of Rocket City. The men and women of the Marshall Space Flight Center know exactly what it takes to be first in space, because you've been doing it for generations. It was here you built the Jupiter-C rocket that carried into orbit America's first satellite, Explorer 1. It was here you spent 15 grueling months executing over 200 tests of the Redstone rocket that launched America's first astronaut into space, Alan Shepard, on the Mercury 7, the Freedom 7 Mercury capsule. And it was here you answered the call of the nation and stunned the world. In less than 8 years, you built a rocket that carried the first men to the moon, the mighty Saturn V that we see before us today. The hardworking men and women of Rocket City have always embodied the American pioneering spirit. Restless energy, urgency, national pride, and impatience with anything less than the best. And we know that it will be here in Rocket City where America will build a new generation of rockets that will carry American astronauts back to the moon, onto Mars, and to worlds beyond. For more than 60 years, Huntsville, Alabama has built the finest rocket propulsion systems in the world. And we want to ensure it remains that way for the next 60 years. As we continue to push farther into our solar system, we'll need innovative new propulsion systems to get us there, including nuclear power. And the President and I know there's no place on Earth better equipped to lead the world in pioneering these new propulsion technologies than Rocket City, USA. Now, the conventional wisdom says that we'll need more time to do what President Trump has challenged us to do, landing American astronauts on the moon within the next 5 years. Some will say it's too hard, it's too risky, it's too expensive. But the same was said back in 1962, when President Kennedy boldly declared that we, in his words, choose to go to the moon in this decade. Our space program was still in its infancy then. NASA was barely 2 years old, and yet President Kennedy knew that history's not written by those who stubbornly cling to the status quo. History is written by those who dare to dream big and do the impossible. Then, as now, the United States didn't have a rocket capable of sending a spacecraft to the surface of the moon. But now, as then, the United States has a president who's a dreamer, who understands that This is a challenge that, once again, we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win again. President Trump knows that meeting this challenge will require a great national investment of time, talent, and resources. But the costs of inaction are greater. The United States must remain first in space in this century as in the last, not just to propel our economy and secure our nation, but above all, because the rules and values of space, like every great frontier, will be written by those who have the courage to get there first and the commitment to stay. And as Americans, and as heirs of this great nation dedicated to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's nothing less than our duty to ensure that our most cherished values are the foundation of mankind's future in space. President Trump is committed to building a space program worthy of our great nation. And we're going to continue to work with leaders in Congress, Senator Shelby and others, to provide the Marshall Space Flight Center and all of NASA the resources they need to meet the goal that we articulated today. But, as I said, mission success will require more than just money. And that's why today, the National Space Council will send recommendations to the President that will launch a major course correction for NASA and reignite that spark of urgency that propelled America to the vanguard of space exploration 50 years ago. As you will hear, in these recommendations, we will call on NASA not just to adopt new policies, but to embrace a new mindset. That begins with setting bold goals and staying on schedule. To reach the moon in the next 5 years, we must select our destinations now. NASA already knows that the lunar South Pole holds great scientific, economic, and strategic value. But now it's time to commit, to go there. And today, the National Space Council will recommend that when the first American astronauts return to the lunar surface, that they will take their first steps on the moon's South Pole. But in order to accomplish this, NASA must transform itself into a leaner, more accountable, and more agile organization. If NASA is not currently capable of landing American astronauts on the moon in 5 years, we need to change the organization, not the mission. To continue to build a world-class workforce, NASA needs the authority to recruit, train, and motivate the world's best and brightest scientists, engineers, and managers, to remove any barriers standing in their way. And that includes building new and renewed partnerships with America's pioneering space companies and entrepreneurs. And in this century, we're going back to the moon with new ambitions. Not just to travel there, not just to develop technologies there, but also to mine oxygen from lunar rocks that will refuel our ships, to use nuclear power to extract water from the permanently shadowed craters of the South Pole, and to fly on a new generation of spacecraft that will enable us to reach Mars not in years, but in months. To develop these new technologies, NASA must adopt an all-hands-on-deck approach to procurement, contracts, and its partnerships. If a commercial company can deliver a rocket, a lunar lander, or any other capability faster at a lower cost to the taxpayer than the status quo, then NASA needs to have the authority and the courage to change course quickly and decisively to achieve that goal. As we proved during the Apollo program, we don't need to sacrifice quality or safety to achieve speed and efficiency. We're not asking anyone to take unnecessary risks. Rather, we're challenging everyone involved in America's space enterprise to think bigger, fail smarter, and work harder than ever before. The task before us will involve sacrifice and determination. hardship, and hazard. But as we embark on this journey, we would do well to remember the words spoken by the late Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon. Before he boarded the lunar module 45 years ago, Gene said, and I quote, "America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow." As Gene Cernan knew then, the exploration of the heavens in this still new century will go forward, with or without the United States. But Americans don't do second place. Americans lead. And so we will. So as we convene this fifth meeting of the still newly reconstituted National Space Council, the President and I are challenging all of you here in Rocket City and all of those involved in the space enterprise that are looking on across the nation. Step up. Get ready to do your part to help lead our nation into the vast expanse of space again. And as we renew our commitment to lead in space, let's go with confidence. And let's go with faith. Faith in the vision and the goal that's articulated today, that we can achieve it. That Americans can achieve anything that we put our minds to. Faith in the extraordinary ingenuity and capability of the men and women of NASA and America's space enterprise, their ability to meet those challenges, if given the resources and the support to do it. And especially faith in the courage of the men and women who are now and those who will join the storied ranks of American astronauts. That next generation of restless pioneers that will carry American leadership into space. It's extraordinary to think of the heroes that will be forged in our renewed commitment to space. And lastly, let's have that other kind of faith as well. Let's have that faith as America renews our commitment to leadership in space, as we call on our best and brightest minds to achieve those goals. We call on our most courageous to suit up and go. That those that we send, let's have faith that they will not go alone. Whereas millions of Americans have cherished throughout our long and storied history of exploration by this nation, let's believe, as the old book says, that there's nowhere we can go from His Spirit. If we rise on the wings of the dawn, if we settle on the far side of the sea, even if we go up to the heavens, there His hand will guide us, and His right hand will hold us fast. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Thanks again to all the members of the National Space Council and all the extraordinary Americans gathered here today. I leave here with confidence that with the leadership of President Donald Trump, with our renewed commitment to space, with the courage and ingenuity of this new generation of explorers, and with God's help, that America will once again astonish the world with the heights we reach, the wonders we achieve, and we will lead the world in human space exploration once again. Now let's get to work. Thank you all. God bless you. thank you all, and again, thank you for the opportunity to address you, but especially thank you all for attending this fifth meeting of the National Space Council, which as chairman, I call to order at this time. And welcome to the Saturn V Hall of the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. Would you give our hosts another round of applause? I also want to thank once again members of our user advisory group. We met briefly before. We'll hear from members of the user advisory group along the course. And let me again thank Governor Kay Ivey and the whole team here in Huntsville and the leadership in Alabama for your great support. Today's meeting is going to offer insight into the progress of our Space Policy Directive 1, as I just discussed, and the goals that we just articulated on behalf of the President of the United States. But first, I want to turn to the chairman of the National Space Council's User Advisory Group and have an opportunity to report on the work that this extraordinary, distinguished group of Americans are doing. Then we will turn to the members of the National Space Council for reports and hear from our panels. But join me in thanking Admiral Jim Ellis for his great leadership and service to the country.
Vice President, members. Thank you for inviting me to provide an update on the activities of the Users Advisory Group to your National Space Council. Thank you as well, Mr. Vice President, for informally addressing the Users Advisory Group members gathered here in Huntsville this morning after the conclusion of their subcommittee preparatory discussions. Your support and encouragement are appreciated as these committees translate those preliminary conversations into future public discussion and comment before the creation of formal findings and recommendations to this Council. Along those lines, the Users Advisory Group held its second public meeting on November 15, 2018 at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. The 6 Users Advisory Group subcommittees each reported their proposed scope of effort, which was formalized in an individual subcommittee terms of reference developed during their preparatory work and approved by NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. A series of selected briefings to the UAG followed. NASA leadership provided an update to the UAG on the state of the National Space Exploration Campaign in compliance with Space Policy Directive 1. The spokesman summarized the plans for transitioning from the ISS, building the Gateway in lunar orbit, and developing a 3-stage architecture intended to return American astronauts to the moon on the dates you noted earlier, 2028. UAG members repeatedly expressed concern at the long timeline and funding sensitivity for the plan, and felt it could open the door to U.S. being passed by a geopolitical rival such as China or Russia in returning to the moon. A few UAG members also questioned the need for the Gateway, viewing it as a diversion of time and resources away from the more important goal of establishing a permanent presence on the lunar surface. Dr. Eric Schmidt also stated the plan did not do enough to incorporate the quick pace of iteration and testing traditionally found in the technology sector. He felt the government needed to do more to incorporate commercial competition and innovation into its architectures going forward. Next, Mr. Jim Crocker, Vice Chair of the Space Studies Board at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, briefed the UAG on his views and the needs of the space science community in the decadal survey process. He likened the current Moon and Mars campaigns to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which were both ambitious technical projects conceived during challenging times. In the last briefing, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy John Rood and Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering Dr. Mike Griffin briefed the UAG on the current state of national security space. Both emphasized the shift away from terrorism to near-peer competitors, such as China and Russia, and the increasing possibility of space becoming a theater of conflict. They described their views on how a space force could function, and Dr. Griffin emphasized the need to make a different bureaucratic culture and silo of information work together in effective and creative ways going forward. Mr. Griffin and a few UAG members ended this section with a frank discussion about the target date of 2028, returning to the moon, being insufficient in today's geopolitical climate. Finally, Mr. Chairman, in the several months since the last UAG meeting, the UAG subcommittees and the executive committee comprised of their chairs have met repeatedly, pursuing their respective topic work plans for public discussion. I have met regularly with the Executive Secretary of your National Space Council to assess, address, and prioritize for National Space Council review and approval a number of recommendations. Of particular value in that process were the 2 sessions we held at the White House with you, Mr. Vice President, which were very helpful in advancing our understanding of how and where the UAG could be most impactful. As you know well, the tasks identified in that process include structuring the UAG for long-term effectiveness, assessing and accelerating the lunar exploration architecture, reviewing elements of the Space Force organization, characterizing effective international space cooperation in support of U.S. space leadership, updating a critical technology roadmap for lunar exploration and beyond, and review of space spectrum policy and process to enhance the competitiveness and security of the U.S. space sector. Focused terms of reference for each of these tasks will be drafted for the Council's review and approval, and followed by appropriate public discussion and the creation of formal findings and recommendations from the Users Advisory Group to the National Space Council. Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the Users Advisory Group, thank you for this update opportunity. We appreciate the focus that you and the National Space Council have brought to our nation's role in space, and we look forward to continuing to support your efforts and to our shared contributions to the future of the nation's space enterprise. I'd be pleased to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Admiral Ellis. In fact, we are so grateful for that report, the energetic work. I would encourage anyone looking on to see the list of extraordinary Americans who are participating in the User Advisory Group, and the council that you're bringing collectively to this effort has contributed mightily over the last 2 years to the progress that we're making. I know a number of members of the User Advisory Group are with you, behind you. Would members of the User Advisory Group go ahead and stand and take a bow wherever you're seated? I know they're all with us. Let's give them all a round of applause. We got some great Americans who are. Thank you all. Thank you all for your contributions, and Admiral Ellis, thank you very much. Very good presentation. Let me turn next to Dr. Kelvin Drogemeyer, who is the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. He was recently confirmed. I had the privilege of swearing him in, and Dr. Drogemeyer, you have hit the ground running. We're eager to hear your perspective, and to welcome to the National Space Council.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to serve the President and the American people as Director of the Office of Science Technology Policy and as a member of this wonderful council. As OSTP Director, my goal is to ensure that America's scientific and research enterprise fosters the next great discoveries and also secures American leadership as we return to the moon and we also venture beyond. From an OSTP's perspective, I want to tell you that later today we are releasing a report on our National Space Weather Strategy and Action Plan that will improve our country's preparedness for space weather events like solar storms and flares that can do great harm to our critical infrastructure and also hamper our ability to conduct operations in space. That plan will be available online and in hard copy report for you. But also, most importantly, for more than a year, OSTP has been reviewing existing nuclear space launch policy, culminating in the creation of an interagency working group co-chaired by OSTP and the National Space Council. These launch systems are critical to the fullest realization of our scientific and exploration objectives. NASA has relied on space nuclear systems over many decades as we went to the moon, and now we're going to Mars and the outer solar system, and for other missions where alternative power sources are inadequate. Our goal for this working group is to ensure that America can safely develop space nuclear systems that enhance our ability for space exploration, our operational capabilities, and also the potential for increased commercial space activities. The working group is now finalizing its recommendations for establishing an updated, risk-informed process for launching space nuclear systems that are funded or licensed by the federal government. This policy update will help ensure that rigorous and effective nuclear safety analysis and review are conducted prior to any launch of space nuclear systems. leveraging our past experience where appropriate, and also the key provisions that provide guidelines to help mission planners obtain launch approval authorities to ensure launch safety. This policy also will direct NASA to establish a standing interagency nuclear safety review board consisting of technically qualified representatives from relevant agencies. And very importantly, this board will analyze all of the safety and federal regulatory space government requirements for space nuclear system launches, and will also be made available to evaluate any potential commercial launch of a space nuclear system that comes under review by the Department of Transportation. In looking at commercial launches, the updated policy will direct the Secretary of Transportation to issue proposed guidance describing DOT's evaluation for any process of any application for a license involving a space nuclear system. This policy update will strengthen the existing process for launching space nuclear systems and will better ensure rigorous, risk-informed safety assessment without excessive redundancy or wasted time. It will also assure an effective response, safety analysis, and launch approval process that is forward-looking and assures and allows the federal government and the private sector entities to effectively use space nuclear systems as we return to the moon and we also venture beyond. Ensuring a rigorous launch safety process is absolutely essential to using space nuclear systems, but we must not stop there. Moving forward, we must also focus on ensuring that we sustain the skills and develop the technologies needed to provide nuclear systems that are ready to propel as well as power American future spacecraft. I look forward to finalizing these recommendations and bringing them before the Council in the coming weeks and working with all of you to implement these and other policy initiatives that will sustain and strengthen American leadership in space. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Drogemeyer, and welcome aboard. Great report. I think there is great enthusiasm among the User Advisory Group and all of us on the National Space Council for nuclear propulsion. And Marshall's going to be the place where we develop those new systems. So thank you for leaning into the effort, and we very much look forward to your recommendations.
Thank you, sir.
So very good to have you here. Next report on the National Space Council Board will be reflective of Space Policy Directive 2. President Trump instructed us to reform existing export controls. We now look to the National Security Council for a report on the progress of that. Earl Matthews is a Senior Director for Defense Policy and Strategy, and Earl, you're recognized. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to provide an update on the administration's export control reforms. Over the past 2 years, you and the President have worked hard to strategically reprioritize the space domain in this era of new great power competition. President Trump has firmly instituted the principle that economic security is national security. The President recognizes that the health and competitiveness of the U.S. defense industrial base is a critical element of U.S. national power. The Trump administration is doing its utmost to ensure that space technology export regulations reflect the realities of today's burgeoning commercial space industry. The administration has taken historic steps to simplify and update export control regulations to ensure that U.S. companies are not only able to compete effectively in the world market, but to dominate that market. As you know, Mr. Vice President, the President signed Space Policy Directive 2, SPD2, titled Streamlining Regulations on Commercial Use of Space in May of 2018. SPD2 was designed to level the commercial space technology marketplace playing field so that U.S. companies, for U.S. companies, while also safeguarding against technological transfers to adversaries and foreign competitors. Pursuant to SPD2, the National Security Council and the National Space Council established the Space-Related Export Controls Interagency Working Group, the IWG, to review space-related export controls as they affect commercial space activity and national security. The IWG has a memorandum before the National Space Council with 4 recommendations regarding the ongoing work of government agencies to improve space-related export control activities by engaging industry. I look forward to this memorandum becoming part of the record today, sir. A decade ago, the State Department averaged somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 space system licenses each year. In 2017, as part of the Export Control Reform Part 2, ushered by the Trump administration, various technologies were transferred from the United States munitions list to the Commerce Control list, which greatly benefited the U.S. space industry. License applications involving the transition of satellites and space technology dropped by 83.7%. In 2018, approximately 300 space system licenses were issued by the State Department because ECR moved the jurisdiction of the bulk of space technologies to Commerce and thus no longer required licenses. The Department of Defense continues to be forward-leaning on export controls for the nascent space tourism industry despite limited flight operations. Adjusting controls in this area is a high priority for the Department of Defense and for the interagency, and is scheduled to begin this summer. We must increase our ability to innovate while remaining dominant in manufacturing leading-edge space technology. We possess the largest, most technologically advanced and active space economy in the world. We must act swiftly, but not hastily, so that we protect our competitive advantage, our intellectual property, and our national security. These issues figure prominently in the Trump administration and are, as you well know, Mr. Vice President, very much a priority for the senior leaders in the White House and the executive branch departments. Thank you for permitting me to bring this critical issue to the leadership of this forum.
Thank you, Earl. Thank you for that report. It is extraordinarily important, as you said, with our American commercial space industry, that we ensure that we update our export controls in a way that allows for growth in the industry without allowing for technologies to fall into the wrong hands. So appreciate you leaning into it, and we'll add the memorandum to the full record of today's National Security Council briefing. Good report. We're going to continue to go through reports from members of the National Space Council, and then we'll go to our panel, and maybe some of these very same issues can come up with a panel or among members. Next, we'll turn to the Secretary of the Air Force, who I mentioned earlier, Heather Wilson. I mentioned in my remarks how grateful I am, and I know the President is, for your efforts and the efforts of the Air Force in moving out on the President's vision for the United States Space Force. So thank you again. Congratulations on your efforts and much success in the future. But Heather Wilson, our Secretary of the United States Air Force, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. On the 1st of March, at the direction of the President, the Defense Department forwarded legislation to the Congress to establish the Space Force as the 6th branch of the United States Armed Forces under the United States Air Force. The new force would have a civilian Under Secretary of the Air Force for Space, a 4-star Space Force Chief of Staff, who would be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a 4-star Vice Chief of Staff. The Air Force has been given the task to plan for the establishment of the force when the legislation is passed by Congress later this year. To make sure we're ready, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Dave Goldfein, and I stood up a Space Force planning group to do the detailed planning and to identify the critical actions needed to stand up the force. This planning group is led by a 2-star general officer and is made up of experts from the Air Force, Army, Navy, Joint Staff, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the intelligence community. The team just completed its initial work plan and turned that in to me last Friday. The plan proceeds in 3 major phases. Within 90 days of enactment into law, we would set up the initial Space Force staff at the Pentagon with 200 people. In the first 3 years, we would transfer to the Space Force the required people, missions, and equipment from all of the services and the relevant agencies to reach initial operating capability. Following that, within 5 years from stand-up, we will transfer the remaining authorities necessary to organize, train, and equip a new service, to maximize our ability to dominate in space in support of the joint force and in partnership with our allies. Detailed planning is now underway so that we are ready to implement as soon as legislation is passed and signed by the President of the United States. Thank you, sir.
Great. I think that's worth a round of applause. Great report. Thank you so much, Secretary Wilson. Thank you for your tremendous and historic leadership in implementing President Trump's vision for the United States Space Force. I want to acknowledge the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Salva with the Air Force. And General, thank you for the way you have worked so closely with the Secretary and working through a process to bring this to fruition. We want to thank you for your great leadership as well. Is there anything you'd like to amplify from the Secretary's report?
No, sir. I appreciate the partnership that's existed across the whole of the department in trying to deliver the legislative proposal, as well as the structures within which all of the forces will be brought into the Space Force. And I particularly want to thank Secretary Wilson, not just as the leader of our Air Force, but as a partner in this endeavor. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Well, very good. Well said. Thank you, General, and thanks again for your great leadership. Next, we will turn to the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, who I want to say to other members of the Council and those looking on, that Secretary Chao has been absolutely instrumental in helping move out on a broad range of reforms that have enlivened greater opportunities in our commercial space industry, and we're just very grateful for your leadership and look forward to your report. Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Fellow council members, I'm pleased to announce that the streamlined launch and re-entry licensing requirements notice of proposed rulemaking is posted today at FAA.gov. It will also be published in the Federal Register, and there will be a 60-day comment period. This NPRM is a major step forward. It has been 12 years since any launch vehicle rules were updated. So this action will strengthen our country's competitiveness in the commercial space sector. The new rule consolidates and revises many launch and re-entry licensing requirements into a single regulation. It also streamlines the licensing process, enables flexible timeframes, redefines when launch begins, and allows the space industry to seek a single license to launch from multiple sites. The goal is, Mr. Vice President, to simplify the licensing process for launch and re-entry activity, enable novel operations, and reduce costs. This effort benefited from the extraordinary support of stakeholders from the public and the private sectors. This is especially true with the FAA's Aviation Rulemaking Committee, comprised of more than 40 individuals from across the commercial sector and the commercial space and aviation sectors. The committee's final report was instrumental in helping the department craft these proposed rules. I also want to thank our partners at the Department of Defense and NASA. They have given considerable time and expertise to this important effort. This collaboration is and will continue to be critical in streamlining the requirements that apply to commercial space operations from federal launch sites. And in ending, I want to commend the President and you especially, Mr. Vice President, for your steadfast leadership and inspiration to all of us to do our best for the benefit of America. So thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Wow. Well, Madam Secretary, thank you. Such great news about the new rule, streamlining commercial space access. Particularly, I would assume, with a lot of the commercial space folks who are here and looking on, the idea of something the National Space Council discussed and recommended, a single license to launch from multiple locations. But what I liked the most, having articulated the President's goal for returning to the moon in 5 years today, is that you hit your mark and posted the rule today. Well done. How about a round of applause for Secretary Chao? That's great. Great job. That is very, very inspiring and great leadership on your part. Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, has been tasked with the equal number of challenges to encourage space innovation, our commercial industry. And I know, Mr. Secretary, you have brought tremendous energy to this. The President and I are very grateful. We look forward to your report on the Department's implementation of Space Policy Directives 2 and 3 in that regard.
Vice President Pence and fellow members of the National Space Council, thank you for the opportunity to update you on the Commerce Department's activities following Space Policy Directives 2 and 3. At the Commerce Department, we see a wave of innovation coming in all areas of space commerce, from remote sensing to high-speed communications, navigation, weather forecasting, satellite servicing, human space exploration, and tourism. Later, there will be space habitation and asteroid mining. So over the past 2 months, we hosted 2 summits connecting leading companies in finance, banking, and insurance, and linking them with commercial space enterprises. Believe it or not, those were the first such events ever held. The space industry needs both increased financing and access to insurance in order to be successful in reaching its forecast $1 trillion of revenues. For Space Policy Directive 2, we have been executing regulatory reforms to show that America is best positioned to support business in space. The new SPD2 report outlines our spectrum strategy for advanced space communication activities as part of the deployment of 5G networks. The SPD2 report we developed with industry input includes recommendations for upgrading our space spectrum allocations and harmonizing international standards for space activities. We have a copy for each council member as in front of their seats, as these are very hot topics, and I have copy number 1 for the Vice President.
Thank you.
Separately, industry has been critical of the Department's regulations on commercial remote sensing, which have not kept pace with rapid advances in technology. Within the interagency discussions, we are trying to reconcile a handful of issues where DOC would like to propose change and DOD prefers a more traditional approach. I hope we can gain consensus on an approach to propose the change while seeking comment on the status quo, as we believe that public comment is essential. You have my commitment to continue to work with the National Space Council on the final rule. Under SPD 3, Commerce Department is also assuming responsibility for space situational awareness and space traffic management for commercial space satellite operators. I recently spent 2 days at Vandenberg Air Force Base meeting with General J. Raymond, Commander of Air Force Space Command, with the 18th Space Control Squadron and our allies at the Combined Space Operations Center. We look forward to working with the General in his new and even more important role running the U.S. Space Force. At Vandenberg, we discussed the need for automation and new technologies to track space debris, especially objects smaller than 10 centimeters, and to be more precise in forecasting conjunctions. Our Office of Space Commerce also is working with industry to enhance access to DoD's authoritative catalog of space debris. We will be the liaison to industry and will deploy a cloud-based open architecture data repository to enhance safety for all space operators. We welcome the contributions of our allies in this endeavor, especially their commercial entities. And toward this end, we will co-host with the State Department an International Space Enterprise Summit with our allies in Washington in late June to discuss these and other issues related to the growing global space economy. Commerce continues to work well with the U.S. Strategic Command, the Air Force, and our friends throughout the DoD and the interagency as we advance the President's SSA-STM mission. By this summer, we will deploy full-time commerce staff at Vandenberg to learn from and work alongside the CSPOC. Finally, Mr. President, let me mention our dedication to creating a Bureau of Space Commerce within the department. That Bureau will provide a clear signal of this administration's commitment to harnessing the power of the U.S. commercial space industry. It will provide this and future administrations with the tools required to ensure the United States continues to lead in this essential global industry. I look forward to the National Space Council being the catalyst for a creation of a $1 trillion space economy based overwhelmingly on the contribution of the U.S. commercial space industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for the report. We look forward to entering it into the record for public review. And just thank, again, as I did with Secretary Chao, I want to thank you. The President and I couldn't be more grateful for the energy that you and your team have brought to reforming the Commerce Department and aligning efforts, not just as you discussed today, regarding spectrum, radio frequency, space traffic management, but just streamlining regulations that will encourage the commercial development of space. One of the very first things that we heard from panelists and from members of our user advisory group and from our private industry is that many of the greatest barriers to our space entrepreneurs have been bureaucratic. In your efforts today, particularly, I want to commend you for the efforts you've taken to initiate a Bureau of Space Commerce within the Department of Commerce, streamlining the ability of our incredible entrepreneurial class in the United States to have access to space. Sometimes I think if the Nina Pinta and the Santa Maria faced the bureaucratic barriers that some of our entrepreneurial explorers face today, they'd have never got out of the harbor in Spain. So how about another round of applause for Secretary Ross and Secretary Chao, really making a difference. Next, I'm going to turn to our NASA administrator, and Then I'll ask for any good of the order comments from any other members of the National Space Council when we call our panel up. But let me just thank you, Jim, for the great leadership, the renewed energy, the morale, the spirit that you've helped to inculcate in NASA. I see it everywhere I go across the country, the way you've been moving out on President Trump's vision, including the goal that was articulated today. You've really brought a can-do spirit to it, and we just couldn't be more grateful for your leadership. Particularly look forward to your comments today, and appreciate your recent comments about moving out on Space Policy Directive 1, returning American astronauts to the moon, developing technologies there, and on to Mars. But join me in thanking NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. Will you please, Jim? You're recognized.
Well, Mr. Vice President, is my mic working, by the way? Excellent. All right. I just want to say, sir, you have given us a charge today, and it is right on time. And I want to say thank you for that vision and the leadership. Our agency, NASA, is going to do everything in its power to meet that vision, to meet that deadline, and you have my full commitment to achieving that. I want to start, if it's okay, Mr. Vice President, by recognizing Dr. Kelvin Droegemeier, who is now the head of OSTP, which is a critical function for our government. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Droegemeier when he was at the University of Oklahoma, a great institution in the heartland of America. I happen to be from Oklahoma, and when I was in the House of Representatives, we worked on a lot of weather issues. And I liked what you talked about today. You talked about space weather, which is a little different than terrestrial weather, but I do believe here in Alabama specifically, given some of the recent activities with tornadoes, we can take advantage of Dr. Droegemeier's expertise and, of course, a lot of others in this government to move us to a day where we can get more lead time on tornadoes. Right now in Oklahoma, it's about 13 minutes. And I think we can move us to a day in this country where we can get a lot longer, and maybe even move us to a day where we have 0 deaths from tornadoes, which has been a big deal for me as a former representative from Oklahoma, where I had constituents every year that died in tornadoes. Okay, now back to NASA. I just wanted to put that on the table.
That's good.
Mr. Vice President, we have had amazing successes since the last National Space Council. I remember, like yesterday, receiving your phone call after we landed InSight on Mars, and the amount of excitement and, quite frankly, jubilation for every piece of data that came back the moment that spacecraft landed on Mars. What an amazing accomplishment. It was on the cover of 240 newspapers worldwide. Talk about transforming, the impression of people all over the world about what America can accomplish. That InSight landing was the 8th time in human history we've landed on Mars softly, successfully, and every single one of those times it's been done by the United States of America. And when you, I know you follow these things very closely, Mr. Vice President, because you call me when they happen. And when you called me on that day, for me to be able to say, listen, team here at the Jet Propulsion Lab, I've got to take a call from the Vice President, that was a shot in the arm to everybody at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So thank you for your really steadfast dedication to what we're trying to achieve. From there, over the holidays, we entered orbit around Bennu, an asteroid in deep space with OSIRIS-REx, which I know, Mr. Vice President, you saw OSIRIS-REx with your own eyes before it launched. And now we are looking forward to a day when it's going to bring a sample back from deep space, a sample of this asteroid, so that we can study it and share it with our international partners, again demonstrating American leadership in deep space. And then over that same holiday break, it was a little bit busy for me at that time, but we flew New Horizons past Ultima Thule, 4 billion miles from Earth in the Kuiper Belt. The furthest object that's ever been explored in deep space, and the science that's coming back from that is still just absolutely astonishing. By the way, the New Horizons spacecraft that did that is the same spacecraft that flew by Pluto in 2014 and gave us those beautiful images, the first time in history of Pluto. And of course, so a lot of very exciting things happening in space exploration. And of course, I know you watched with great interest and came over to the NASA headquarters when the Crew Dragon docked to the International Space Station. Another amazing moment, a first in the history. Yes. A first in the history of the United States, where we want to be a customer in low Earth orbit. We want to be one customer of many. We want numerous providers that are competing on cost and innovation to drive down cost, to give us more capability and improve safety. And we believe that this is a critical capability. I was there last year at the Space Symposium when you said very clearly that we want to be a tenant in low Earth orbit. We don't want to be the landlord. Right. And with commercial resupply and now on the horizon, commercial crew and eventually commercialization of low Earth orbit with habitation, commercial habitats, we are on the precipice of commercializing low Earth orbit with a specific goal, which is, sir, we want to go to the surface of the moon, and we want to go quickly. That's the objective. So if we can drive down costs and increase access, commercialize low Earth orbit, and I know Secretary Chao and Secretary Ross are giving it all of their attention to help us commercialize, then we can go to that next step, which is leading a coalition of nations to the surface of the moon. And now with your charge today, sir, 2024. We got it, loud and clear. So that's underway. So the challenges that you outlined today, and we've talked about in your office with SLS and making sure that we can accelerate the agenda, we understand that. We got it loud and clear. And I did open up the window to having commercial opportunities to launch the Orion crew capsule around the moon. We have been under review for a lot of different commercial capabilities to achieve that. And sir, what I can tell you is that there is an opportunity there in the future. I will also tell you, if we want to achieve 2024, we have to have SLS. We have to accelerate its agenda. And when we talk about being able to co-manifest payloads, we talk about putting humans on a spacecraft with habitation modules at the same time and delivering to the moon all at once, we're going to need an exploration upper stage, and we're going to need that probably early by EM3, the third launch of the Space Launch System. So there's a lot to achieve. We're working right now at making sure that every moment of time that we are using to develop SLS and the Orion crew capsule, we are only doing what is absolutely necessary to get to that first launch and not adding to the mix, whether it's additional testing or having serial assembly rather than parallel assembly. We are trying to eliminate any extra time in order to get to that first launch as soon as possible. And Mr. Vice President, I can tell you, I am confident we can get to that first launch in 2020 for SLS and actually fly a crew capsule around the moon. I heard earlier Admiral Ellis mentioned that there was some concern about the gateway. I've heard those same concerns. I think it's important to note what the gateway is. I heard you say, sir, you want to get to the south pole of the moon, and that's going to be where our first astronauts land. What the gateway does is it enables us to get to more parts of the moon than ever before. The Apollo program, we landed at the equatorial regions. What we want to do now is have a reusable command module with propulsion that can get to more parts of the moon than ever before. From 1969 up until 2008, we believed, some people would doubt it today, but most people believed that the moon was bone dry. 2008 and 2009, NASA made important discoveries, hundreds of millions of tons of water ice on the poles of the moon. That means life support, it's air to breathe, it's water to drink, it's in fact hydrogen and oxygen, which is rocket propulsion on the surface of the moon. We want to be able to get to that polar region. We need a reusable command module. We need a command module that can, no kidding, maneuver around the moon. That's what the Gateway is all about. Given what the user advisory group has said, and I think they're right, We need an early command module that is focused exclusively on getting humans to the surface of the moon, and I think that's what it ought to be about, and that's what it is about, given your direction today. We will be using the Gateway as a reusable command module to get boots on the moon as soon as possible. Right. So you can count on that in the coming years, I should say. So there's a lot happening. There's a lot of excitement. Sir, your vision, one thing that I heard you say today that I thought was just phenomenal, you said, fail smarter. Those words are important for NASA to understand. One of my first initiatives as the administrator was the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, which says we're going to deliver small payloads to the surface of the moon by just buying the service rather than owning and operating the hardware. I'm going to follow Secretary Chao and tell you today, sir, we just released the first task order this morning to achieve that, and there's some people maybe out here in the audience who need to be checking their email right now because that task order is out. Proposals are due in a month, and a month after that, we're going to be awarding those proposals to commercially land small payloads on the surface of the moon as soon as possible, maybe 2019. The goal, of course, is 2020 to get payloads to the surface of the moon. The important thing there, sir, following your direction, fail smarter. We think of this, these are inexpensive missions. We anticipate there will be failure. I want to be really clear. That is not, when we see failure, that is not necessarily failure because we are learning. These are inexpensive missions with a little more risk than normal, but there's no human lives involved. But at the end of the day, if they are successful, the return is exceptionally high, especially if we want to get boots on the moon in 2024. So that, I think, is a great direction where we're heading right now. So, sir, your charge today was fantastic. So grateful for it. This agency is up to the task. We're going to do everything we can to meet it. Thank you, sir.
Great. Great report, sir. Great report. Thank you, Jim. Thanks for that great report. I know it's an inspiration to people here at Marshall, the Space Center, and to people that are looking on all over the country. We really appreciate your energetic leadership, and really, you're the right man for the job right now.
Thank you.
So thank you for moving out.
Thank you.
Thank you for moving out. Okay, with that, I wanted to recognize a couple of people for impromptu remarks, if they have them. Any reaction? Sue Gordon is the Principal Deputy Director, National Intelligence. Sue, any thoughts for the National Space Council today on topics raised?
So I think this is incredibly exciting. The intelligence community has been a silent partner in space for both of our histories, and the opportunities, not just that Heather is articulating for the Space Force, but I think the space enterprise are exciting. And the second is personal. I'm a child of the space race. How in the world can it have been 47 years since what I remember most of my childhood is my 11th birthday watching Neil Armstrong land at the moon, and this means I'm way older than I think I am. Holy smokes. Anyway, great opportunity. You all will each have us as your closest partner. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's great. Thank you, Sue Gordon. Thank you for your great work in the intelligence community, and yeah, the American people should know. It's especially well put. Our intelligence community has been a silent partner of the American space program for generations, and it's been a partnership that's contributed to the safety and security of the American people. So we thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Andrea Thompson, Under Secretary of State, Department of State, your thoughts on today's meeting.
Great, thank you, sir. Just very briefly, what I heard from all the members that have spoken this morning, there is a common theme, and a common theme from the individuals here at Rocket City that we had a little bit of a tour earlier. The common theme is leadership. Whether it's leadership on the line, whether it's leadership in the lab, whether it's leadership here with policy, that's what's going to make a difference for for this space policy is the leadership involved. So just thank everyone here and know that the leadership of the State Department fully supports the efforts, whether it's co-hosting the summit with Secretary Ross and his team in June, whether it's working with NSC, with the defense partners and others on our very antiquated export control system, that we are now making a modern and agile export control system. So for the industry reps out here, it shouldn't take years, it should take months, and in some cases should take weeks. So we stand in support, sir, for your efforts and the Space Council's efforts to modernize our diplomatic efforts. So we thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Very, very well said, Colonel. Secretary Thompson. Great friend, served the country for many years. Claire Grady is the Acting Deputy Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. Claire, your thoughts for the record today.
Yes, sir. We are really excited by the innovation and commitment we see across the board and the cooperation with industry. At this point, we have not, from a Homeland Security, been able to contribute as much as some of the other members of the panel, but we're very much supportive of everything that's happened and look forward to continuing to help to advance, as well as ensuring that we're considering security as we proceed, particularly with the rapid expansion of the space industry. Cybersecurity will become a major factor, and it already is. And we stand behind and excited to support all the progress that is being made, and the acceleration is exciting, and the innovations that will come will benefit not just the space industry, but the entire government and the entire American people.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Thanks for being here and for the Secretary's strong support of the National Space Council's work. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to ask a couple other members of the panel to speak for the record, but the first panel, if the first panel wants to make their way, General, if you want to start to head up, you all can get situated, get comfortable, and I'll introduce you when we conclude. Office of Management and Budget, I can tell the members of the National Space Council has been a full partner in this effort. The President has sent to Congress and already signed into law in previous appropriations the largest NASA budgets in recent memory. And Jim Hertz, the Associate Director of OMB, has been critical to that. Jim, thanks. Your thoughts?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, OMB has been a critical partner in this effort, and we look forward to continuing to be a partner. We just released the President's budget. In the past couple of weeks, we put very strong requests for space exploration, especially in lunar. I can walk you through some of the highlights, but I can tell you, just in summary, very strong request for space exploration. We look forward to seeing your vision to return U.S. astronauts to the moon in 2024.
Great. Well, we'll be coming to OMB.
I expect you will, yes.
Isn't that right, Governor? We'll be headed that way. Thank you. Thanks for the great support, Jim. I know it's heartfelt, and we're grateful to you. I'm going to go ahead and ask you, Jim, grab your chair and come around to the other side here so that everybody on the panel has a clear line of sight for our panelists. And I'll ask Admiral Doug Fears to do the same, Deputy Assistant to the President for Counterterrorism, Homeland Security. Doug, your thoughts, and thank you for your involvement here.
Yes, sir. Thank you for your leadership in this, and the President's as well. You know, as Acting Deputy Secretary Grady said, you know, the Homeland nexus here is pretty clear in the future of cyber, as well as position navigation and timing as that relates to our critical infrastructure. And so we're excited that we have a vision. We're excited that we have leadership, and we're grateful to be a part of it. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Doug. And if you want to resituate.
Yes, sir. Yep.
And you can sidle up to the table. You don't need to stand on ceremony. You're fine. I just wanted to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to see and interact with all of our panelists. Let me introduce all three of the panelists. These are three incredible Americans. We are very grateful for your participation today. General Les Lyles is former Air Force Vice Chief of Staff, Commander of Air Force Materiel Command. He serves as director of a number of Fortune 500 aerospace defense engineering companies in the past. He's currently a key member of the National Space Council's User Advisory Group. Our second panelist is Colonel Eileen Collins, who is no stranger to these environs. She flew on 4 shuttle missions, including STS-63, as the first female shuttle pilot. STS-93 as the first female shuttle commander, and STS-114 as the commander of the shuttle's post-Columbia return to flight. And she said to me today at the User Advisory Group she was especially excited to hear that the first woman on the moon would be an American.
Hear, hear.
So thank you for your pioneering leadership, your inspiring example. The third panelist is Dr. Sandy Magnus, also a four-time shuttle astronaut who flew as a mission specialist on STS-135 in 2011, and the most recent orbital crewed flight from U.S. soil. From 2012 to 18, she served as the executive director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And Dr. Sandy Magnus, thank you for your courageous leadership, for your contributions to the nation past and present. Join me in thanking all three of these panelists for their lifetimes of service. I'm going to recognize Dr. Sandy Magnus first, and we'll hear from each of the panelists, your comments, and then we'll take questions from the panel. The topic of this panel is we're ready to fly. We feel like for many years, many of you, and particularly those of you involved in the User Advisory Group, the National Space Council, are ready to see American human space exploration leading, reaching out once again in space. I want to thank you for pressing us on that, and we look forward to your remarks on that theme today. So, Dr. Sandy Magnus, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, members of the National Space Council, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to appear before you today on the eve of the return of human spaceflight capability to the U.S. and share my thoughts on this long-awaited milestone. 2019 is a special year for the space sector. In October, we are welcoming the international space community to Washington, D.C. to attend the International Astronautical Congress to celebrate the amazing accomplishments of the Apollo program. In 2019, we also eagerly look to the future. 50 years after Apollo, American innovation and leadership are once again transforming how humans engage in space. This year, potentially as many as 4 new U.S. space vehicles will begin suborbital and orbital operations, not only providing our country with the long-awaited renewed independent human access to low Earth orbit, but also expanding and diversifying travel off of our planet. We still have a lot to learn and many challenges yet remain, but I'm excited about the opportunities ahead. With our own human launch capability, we can decide on the cadence of missions to the ISS. Our efforts to grow a private sector, non-governmental dependent business base in low Earth orbit will accelerate with the ability to expand the number of missions and who may fly. If we so choose, we will soon have the opportunity to send creative engineers and scientists, inventors and technologists for short duration stays on the ISS to spark their imaginations and deepen their understanding of the potential for utilization of microgravity. The resumption of human launches from U.S. soil is also an opportunity for us to inspire and engage our young people and indeed all of our citizenry. A vibrant, active, highly visible space program provides an excellent method to engage our youth in the STEM fields. The fact that we have not had an indigenous human launch capability for nearly 8 years to inspire young people is profoundly disturbing. We have failed an entire generation, and I'm excited that is shortly to be remedied. This year, after a long wait and much anticipation, private citizens traveling to the near reaches of space will experience our planet in new ways. Their brief suborbital journey will provide them a life-changing perception about gravity, Earth, and our relationship as humans to our home. Similar to the iconic photo of the Earth titled Earthrise, taken from the moon during Apollo 8 that sparked the environmental movement, the expansion of humans who experience our planet as I have as one interconnected home to all of us will inspire a renewed commitment to working together to solve some of the complex problems facing us. As we look forward this year to these and other opportunities that will emerge, the future is ours to shape. But in the process of creating that future, we have lessons to relearn and we'll have new challenges to address. It has been nearly 8 years since we have launched humans into space, and in the subsequent gap, we have lost critical personnel and corporate knowledge. The successful launch of the SpaceX Demo 1 flight earlier this month, where the NASA and SpaceX teams worked closely to exercise in full the processes and procedures required to launch humans, bears testament to the fact that we can relearn these skills. Operational skills are perishable, and a regular cadence of launches will benefit everyone. As we expand into the new frontier facing us, space, we will continue to wrestle with the question, how safe is safe enough? As we debate acceptable risk levels, we must be honest about what we know and what we don't know. We must have frank discussions about our risk posture, how to deal with the consequences of our decisions, about lessons learned from failures, and how to implement those inevitably costly lessons to avoid making the same mistake twice. The private companies that are currently interested in and will be engaging in activities in space are motivated to create the safest systems they can. The success of their businesses depends upon it. But as activities in low Earth orbit evolve and uncouple from government-driven missions, the imperative for private companies to produce profit will enter into the calculus in a more direct and influential way. Like other industries that have struggled with this question, for example, mining, shipping, oil, the emerging private space sector will need to find its balance between profit and safety. I believe this will be one of the most difficult lessons we will learn as a community over the coming decade and beyond. It is important to visualize the desired long-term steady-state ecosystem we want to establish as we increase human presence in low Earth orbit. To realize that vision, we must constantly question why we do the things the way we currently do them. The assumptions and experiences that informed our current processes and procedures may or may not be applicable for the ecosystem we are trying to create. This will be hard. Probing why will challenge the status quo and create tension across the community. Institutions, jobs, and even infrastructure that currently exist will have to evolve or become obsolete. However, Americans are good at tackling complex problems, and I have faith that the necessary change is possible. We are on the verge of great things. Resuming independent, assured human access to space is the next step to take Americans to the stars. Access to space is the key enabler, and this year, as we get ready to go fly human beings once again, we are regaining that access, not just in a singular manner, but in a multiplicity of ways. I can say with confidence on behalf of the host space community that we are very excited about the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Magnus. We'll come back. You said a number of things that the chair would like to have you elaborate on, but very inspiring, very challenging words. Colonel Eileen Collins is recognized for your testimony, and again, thank you for your career. Each one of you on this panel are incredible Americans, and thank you particularly for your participation in the User Advisory Group for this council.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and good afternoon. Also, distinguished members of the National Space Council, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. I'm excited as we look forward to launching American astronauts again from inside the United States. This summer, plans are in place for NASA, in cooperation with SpaceX and Boeing, to launch astronaut crews to the International Space Station for the first time. We will be freed from our dependence on the Russian Soyuz. Now, I will digress briefly to mention an important point that the Russians have been very good partners since we began working with them in the Shuttle Mir program back in 1993. But using only one launch vehicle is a risky policy for many reasons. So, having said that, I believe that our future model of commercial human spaceflight will be successful in accessing our space station as well as reaching for new opportunities in low Earth orbit. So how can I say that? Because in addition to our current space station research, other opportunities are compelling. And some examples are space solar power, in-space manufacturing, and even tourism. And eventually, I believe these activities will bring economic benefit. Space Policy Directive 2 has expedited our regulatory process, and Space Policy Directive 3 is directing our solutions to space traffic management, I believe in the most efficient way, and very importantly, with U.S. leadership. And I urge continued focus in this area. Now, as I am optimistic that the first several commercial crew flights will be safe and successful to the space station, I also believe that down the road there will be periods of strong growth and weak growth. And we cannot expect growth in low Earth orbit to be as predicted. And we cannot force operational status on these commercial launch vehicles too soon. And we see why as we observe the history of the Space Shuttle program. One of the causes of both the Challenger and Columbia accident was that they were declared operational too soon. NASA, while cooperating with commercial partners, must adopt a flight schedule consistent with the available resources. I was the commander of the first flight after the Space Shuttle Columbia accident. I have personally grown and matured through the accident investigation and the return to flight activities. Private industry must learn from NASA's past experience. Employees of commercial companies must routinely study the lessons learned from Challenger and Columbia. And of course, this applies to NASA also. But I have observed good indications here. Many of the employees that I have talked with have done this. The best place to start is the excellent report written by the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, more commonly known as the CABE report. While the technical lessons are important, more applicable are the cultural lessons. And I describe that in more detail in my written remarks. Those parts of the report should be studied by all employees of our commercial partners, not just the management. Will the new spacecraft be safer than the shuttle? Yes. They are designed to reduce the inherent risk. These launch vehicles will have an ejection system that the Space Shuttle did not have. This new system could possibly save the lives of the crew in a future Challenger-type accident. Also, because the crew capsule is on top of the rocket, that configuration could prevent a future Columbia-type accident because the heat shield is protected. So because of their design, the new spacecraft and launch vehicles are inherently safer. But the residual risk must be constantly managed by leadership which must be humble in their open-mindedness and confident in the ability of their people. Make no mistake, this is a serious business and a dangerous business. But it can be done safely and successfully as long as the planners and operators remain focused, professional, and disciplined. As the flight rate of commercial crew increases, which it needs to be economically sustainable, we need to be smart about when we move from a test vehicle to an operational vehicle. And this includes the flights carrying tourists, suborbital and orbital. And you do this with the guidance of your flight test plan. So while cost and schedule are always our focus, as they need to be, we don't want to push too hard and too fast, not consistent with our available resources. And finally, human spaceflight will never be 100% safe. There always will be risk. But greatness was never achieved by doing the same things over and over again. And greatness was never achieved by avoiding risk. So this year, the United States will be accomplishing something new and exciting, launching our astronauts to our space station in next-generation spacecraft, developed by government and industry working together in a new and more efficient way. I believe we can and will do it safer. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Colonel Collins. Thank you for those inspiring words and admonitions. We'll come back and talk to you about risk management when we get to questions. General Les Lyles is recognized. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking a leadership role on the User Advisory Group.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your leadership. Vice President Pence said there's no lesson learned. Never follow an astronaut when you're giving a presentation, let alone two of them. So I have that dubious honor right now, and it's just great to be on this particular panel. Vice President Pence, distinguished members of the National Space Council, I'm honored to be part of this historic moment as the United States continues to return to space preeminence and begins an aggressive new journey to inspire, to innovate, and to discover. Now, some in the audience may recognize that last statement was the title of a June 2004 report of the President's Commission on Implementation of the United States Space Exploration Policy. That report also had a subtitle, which was Moon, Mars, and Beyond. I had the privilege of being a member of that commission, which was created by President George W. Bush in January 2004, and was led by former Secretary of the Air Force Pete Aldrich. Other Moon, Mars, and Beyond commissioners included former Congressman Bob Walker, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, Carly Fiorina, and several noted space scientists and experts. In contemplating the subject this panel was asked to address, Ready to Fly, I thought it might be instructive to briefly revisit some of the recommendations of that 2004 report, all of which, or most of which I should say, have been embraced in full or partially by NASA over the intervening years, and they're certainly codified by the visionary New Space Policy and Directives, Space Policy 1, 2, 3, and 4 from you and from the President. The transmittal letter of that 2004 report by the Moon, Mars, and Beyond Commission stated, quote, "A journey of exploration will sustain vital national objectives here on Earth. It will provide inspiration for our youth to enter technical fields. It will generate economic benefit to our nation through the creation of additional technical jobs. It will improve the competitiveness of our industrial base in the world marketplace. It will provide clear recognition of America's leadership and improve prosperity and quality of life for all Americans," unquote. If I think back, similarly today, our new U.S. space agenda, advanced by our space policy directives, and the new goal that you've given us today will significantly help the United States protect its technological leadership, its economic vitality, and security. The Moon, Mars, and Beyond Commission of 2004 made one major recommendation, that the United States Space Exploration Program should be managed as a significant national priority, with clear commitment and leadership from the President, from the Congress, and from the American people. The Commission advised that to ensure such commitments, the U.S. Space Exploration Program must be sustainable, it must be affordable, and it must be credible. And to define, it stated that sustainable means over multiple government cycles, necessitating that its value is always clearly demonstrated and articulated, particularly to the public. It must be sustainable by having a clear set of objectives and goals, sustainable by having an architecture that is scalable to address all elements of exploration, from the Moon to Mars and to beyond. Affordable by staying on course and schedule, and we articulated a new terminology. We stated that the program should be flexible enough to allow a go-as-you-pay sort of approach. That is, if budgets do fluctuate, we would never stray from our goal and our objectives, and we would always make progress regardless of what the budget fluctuations may say. The program must be credible, involving diverse participants from private industry, from space entrepreneurs, international partners, space innovators, both for space operations and for space services. And then finally, credible by exhibiting and having a management structure with clear, streamlined authorities and clear accountabilities. These three principles, sustainability, affordability, and credibility, are still very, very much important today, and really apply to our current space exploration vision and policies. And Mr. Vice President, all of them were addressed in some form or another by the new bold space policy that you clearly articulated to us this morning. Now, while the Moon, Mars, and Beyond Commission did not focus on national security space initiatives, most of its recommendations were equally applicable to the broader aspects of the space enterprise: national security, including intelligence community, civil and commercial space. In 2007, a different commission, the Allard Commission, named after former Colorado Senator Wayne Allard, was established to make an independent assessment of the organization and management of national security space programs. To sum up very quickly, the Allard Commission of 2007 made a couple of major recommendations. Number one was that we needed to return to having a National Space Council. Obviously, that has been done. It also made a recommendation that we should have a cohesive, very strong national security set of space activities and leadership. That, to me, is what you've done with the new Space Force. So we are really setting the stage for everything we need to do for the future. These previous commissions are perhaps examples of the old saying, the past is prologue, but to me, we've stepped up the game considerably. Today, we clearly have the right policies, we have the right organizational structure, we have the right leadership, we have the right goals, and as you can see from the people beside me, we have the right people involved. And I clearly can say that without any pun intended, all the stars are aligned. And for me, Mr. Vice President, as a member of both the Moon, Mars, and Beyond Commission and the Allard Commission, I can tell you I'm excited, I'm enthusiastic, I'm very optimistic about the future of the U.S. space enterprise, and in my opinion, we are ready to fly. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Thank you for those great remarks. And I want to thank the entire panel. We're going to roll through some questions fairly quickly, but a couple of questions initially based on your testimony. I'll go in the reverse order. General Lyles, so the Moon, Mars, and Beyond Commission, 2004, many of the recommendations President Trump has put into effect through space policy directives. What was it? What do you think is catalyzing? And I know how grateful you are for the leadership the President and the administration have brought to this, but the 15-year gap, is it? Do you sense that our burgeoning commercial space industry, which was not in evidence 15 years ago, we have a sense of the enthusiasm all across the board, and stipulating that the President's call for renewed American leadership in space has made a difference. What else do you think is different today than 15 years ago when many of these same ideas came forward but weren't acted upon?
Well, Vice President Pence, clearly I can't discount leadership and how much that really has made a difference relative to where we are. But I guess probably another strong word is commitment. There have been several iterations, as many of the panel members and certainly members of the council know, there have been several iterations of starting a commercial space industry and commercial space activities. They faltered in some form or another because of a lack of commitment, including with resources. The technological aspect has certainly grown significantly, but we've always been, as somebody said earlier, on the precipice of having that ability to take advantage of the great technology here in the United States. So to me, the big difference is a full commitment of everybody that really this is something we need to do. I can't discount the threat, obviously. Perhaps that's an underlying catalyst that really has helped step up the game, if you will. But the leadership and commitment has really made the difference.
Thank you. Sandy Magnus, you made the comment that in the intervening 8 years, we lost a lot, including critical personnel. With the goal the President put forward today, can you express what is your level of confidence about the ability of NASA and our contracting community to attract the personnel to meet this objective and beyond?
Well, I think...
how quick can we catch up?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's different layers of problems to tackle with it. I think it's good, first of all, to have a definite, okay, no kidding, this is what we should be doing, and that the space community is very good at solving complex problems. That's what we do.
Right.
I think there are different layers to this particular challenge that have to be addressed, and there's the one that I think is most important is the technological layer, to make sure as we look at these systems and how we can achieve the goal that you set forth today, that we make sure we tackle the technology part intelligently and smartly, and several times people have mentioned smart failures. I think that's really key. I think the community has to feel comfortable with being able to fail. We have, in the space community, what we do is really hard, and over the years, people worry about failing because they're worried about the commitment to the program in the long term. So knowing there's long-term commitment to the program will open up the aperture for failure a little bit intelligently. I think the other part of the problem that has to be tackled is how we manage these kinds of programs and how we continue to work through the bureaucratic issues that you so adequately addressed earlier. I think our community is up for it. I think it will be challenging, and I look forward to hearing some of the technology parts as we go forward, because we want to make sure that we're doing it safely as well.
Right. Thank you. Very great insight. I just thought that the whole notion of human capital, but I love your comment about this community, that they're problem solvers, right? And now we have a goal, and they can work backwards from the goal about how we accomplish it on time. Every confidence, just as you do. Let me ask one last question, then I'm going to go to Dr. Drogemeyer, and I'm going to ask a couple of members of the panel to take one question. If you can, we'll stay on time. But Eileen Collins, you mentioned this very humbly, but you were a commander of Discovery, which was the first flight back after the Columbia tragedy. And I acknowledge your personal courage and that of your fellow astronauts at that time. It is greatly to your credit that you talked today already about recognizing risk. If you had one message, and you spoke about our contractors listening, you said it's a serious business, it's a dangerous business, private industry listening in. Is there any additional message? Because we don't, those of us who support this program, support the President's vision, we're looking for courageous Americans in this generation of astronauts to do what you had the courage to do. And we want to do it safely. And can you just speak about any, as people are looking on, the people who are going to be implementing this under Jim Bridenstine's direction, any further word?
Yes, sir. I really appreciate the question. There's actually so many, but to boil it down, having trust in your people, leadership needs to be humble, open-minded. It doesn't always have to be done the way it's always been done. We need to be creative in the way we're thinking. And just as, I'll use one example, there is a term called normalization of deviance, and it was coined by a sociologist who wrote a book on the Challenger accident. So a system is designed to work a certain way, and then you start flying, and it's not doing what you had expected it to be doing. For example, O-rings are burning through, or foam is falling off the external tank. You keep flying, and all of a sudden, well, that's okay. It's normalization of deviance. So that is something we can look out for. I think that especially in Columbia, it was very subtle. It, was something that, even the smartest people missed. I do want to say I had wonderful support from NASA. My whole crew, the astronaut office, had wonderful support from throughout NASA in the return to flight period. And I think it was pretty much a big shock that got us back to flying safely again. And I think if we remember these cultural lessons, creativity, humility, open-mindedness, we're in a very dangerous business. Learn from the past lessons. So thank you for the question.
Well, thank you for the very insightful answer. And look, the President wants us to renew American commitment to human space exploration. You astronauts are heroes because you understand the risk. But our job on the ground is to minimize that risk to the greatest extent possible. And you have our promise to do that. And we'll internalize the lessons and the counsel that you've offered here today going forward. So thank you very much. Let me go, we're going to move quickly through some questions from members of the Space Council. Director Drogemeyer.
Thank you, Vice President Pence. We oftentimes hear about the need for a Sputnik moment, and this truly is a Sputnik moment. We're at an inflection point in the history of our nation that is really propelling us forward into that next generation of what we experienced when we were young, inspiring people to, just get into science and get excited and do great things. So it's really extraordinary. My question is, as we think about the tremendous opportunities for exploration types of research, when we go to the moon and then beyond to Mars, there's all kinds of things: biological research, geological research, human health research, manufacturing and low gravity, and so on. What do you see as the science frontiers that really we could capture as a nation to really explore the unknown? What are the big science challenges out there that you see? Because this is something that we as a government and a private sector collectively need to think about. What are those great scientific challenges and frontiers that we should be pushing forward to?
Are you referring to mainly human spaceflight or science in general?
Really science in general, but especially what can be accomplished by our missions to Moon and then to Mars.
Well, certainly, I think we went to the moon before, and we brought samples back, and we have analyzed those samples, but we only really went to part of the moon, and I think there's some interesting data that we've discovered since those decades ago of things that we should go investigate at the poles, for example, as the Vice President mentioned earlier, an interesting place for people to go. We also have different technologies now, and so I think not just only from a science viewpoint, but from a utilization and technology development viewpoint, what we can do on the moon. And of course, you can take that whole conversation and go to Mars and have that same sort of exploratory look at what we can do with using the planet. So I think that's definitely kind of a mix of science and technology, so not just science. But if you're speaking about exciting the youth and exciting the country about what we're doing, I think those are the kind of things that would do that. Thank you.
Any other statements, panels?
I'll just make a comment on the Kepler satellite, which is now not working anymore. The purpose was to find Earth-like planets outside of our solar system. I find it to be incredibly inspiring, especially for young people and people that want to know what's out there. So the Kepler satellite actually looked at a very small piece of the sky, and they found maybe 2,000 potentially Earth-like planets. The number keeps changing. If you could take that piece of sky and go all the way around the sphere with it, they say there's something like potentially 10 billion Earth-like planets. And I just find that incredibly inspiring from the science side. And now the TESS satellite is up there doing a similar mission to the Kepler.
And Dr. Drogemeyer, I think one of the answers to your question is sort of addressed by the International Space Station today. It is designated as a national laboratory, and probably the greatest user in terms of commercial purposes are pharma companies. They're doing biological and medical research that you couldn't even begin to address or think about here on Earth. And that's another reason why we need to make sure we maintain a low Earth orbit presence and maintain something like the International Space Station to continue to find out things that we can't learn here on Earth.
Great. Secretary Chao?
I'm fine. I think the questions have been really inspiring. I am just so in awe of the panelists, the two female astronauts, the first woman to be the shuttle mission commander. I'm just totally in awe, and I'm learning so much.
So are we. Jim Bridenstine, something quick? And then we'll move on to our next panel.
Yes, sir. I'll be quick. General Lyles, I know you, of course, had a very distinguished career in the Air Force. There are procurement authorities that exist in the Air Force, DX Procurement Authority. Would you mind sharing with the panel what that is and how it works, and if NASA could benefit from it?
Thank you, Administrator. And one of the key things I think is going to lead to help address some of the things we're trying to do, particularly very quickly, is to make sure we have all the authorities, take advantage of all the authorities that are available. DX authorities, Section 804 authorities from the current National Defense Authorization Act, RCO, Rapid Capability Offices that we have in DOD, Secretary Wilson, General Silva know them very, very well. They're examples of where the rules either already allow us to do things in a streamlined manner, but we don't take advantage of it, or we needed to have some ways to get around some of the rules to allow us to do things quickly. So I'm hoping that, and commend to you that NASA take a very close look with all the examples in the Department of Defense, and it won't take very long because they're doing it every day to see the kinds of things that you can use likewise to streamline the efforts that you're working on.
Great. Very good. With that, join me in thanking this really outstanding panel for their insights today and, frankly, for their extraordinary careers of service. Well done. With that, we'll invite our second of two panels to come forward. For those looking on or in attendance, we will then accept recommendations to be forwarded to the President, and we'll complete our work. But again, thank you to the panel for those great words. Today's second panel features three experts from space science operations community. Each of them have incredible careers running major programs and are going to focus on a theme of ready to explore. Our first panelist is Dr. Jack Burns, professor of Astrophysical and Planetary Sciences at University of Colorado Boulder. He was awarded the Master of Science PhD, of course, at Indiana University. So he's a very distinguished scholar. Dan Dumbacher is the Executive Director of American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He was Deputy Associate Director of NASA's Human Exploration Directorate from 07 to 14. Dan did receive his MBA from the University of Alabama, but a BA from Purdue University.
There it is.
If you're picking up a theme, it's real. And finally, Wanda Seger is an independent consultant with a career steeped in civil space exploration, 38-year career at Lockheed Martin. She actually was vice president of the Civil Space System. She oversaw some of the most prolific human space flight and space science missions. Join me in welcoming this outstanding panel. We look forward to their comments. Thank you. Dr. Jack Burns is recognized, and we'll move on to questions after your brief opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, members of the National Space Council. I'm honored to join you all this afternoon. Dr. Magnus and I were privileged to be members of the Presidential Transition Landing Team, and we found in our analysis that America is ready to explore again and should lead the world in these new voyages of discovery by, among other things, demonstrating a preeminence in space by rapidly expanding humanity into the solar system, incorporating public-private and, as I like to add, academic partnerships. This goal is incorporated in the President's Space Policy Directive 1 and in the challenge that we heard from the Vice President today. But to carry out this visionary program, NASA must have adequate resources. We must be realistic in recognizing, as was true with the early airline and computer industries, that the federal government will be the anchor tenant in the development of cislunar space over the next decade or so. But those investments today will enable entrepreneurs to close their business plans for the future. The moon is the obvious and practical destination for space exploration in the next few years. However, before we begin, we need to clearly articulate the reasons for going to the moon so the Congress and the public will embrace this goal. Pieces of this plan exist currently, but it also lacks cohesion. Those components include things like the Commercial Lunar Payload Services, the CLPS program that we heard a little bit about a few minutes ago. I'm part of a team that was selected as one of those payloads for the surface, a low radio frequency experiment on the surface that is a prototype of an array that we hope to put on the far side. Administrator Bridenstine mentioned this in his remarks a couple weeks ago as part of the budget rollout. We appreciate that. Secondly, before we put boots on the ground at the poles, we urgently need a robotic water ice prospecting mission to the lunar poles. As we've heard, water ice is a game changer. Potentially, we can break those constituents of hydrogen and oxygen and reassemble them into rocket fuel. But it's a very challenging exercise. Those permanently shadowed craters are at a temperature of only 40 degrees above absolute zero. How difficult is it for humans and machines to operate under those challenging conditions? What is the nature of that water ice? How easy or difficult is it to extract? So we need a mission in the next couple years to get this going. We also need a mission, a robotic mission to the lunar far side to return samples. Recently, we heard about the Chinese landing on the far side. I personally was greatly disappointed that the U.S. was not the first on the moon. This is after spending tens of millions of dollars of NASA funding to plan what exploration and science missions are. But of course, there's still much to be done from the far side. The far side contains the oldest, deepest, largest impact basin in the solar system called the South Pole Aitken Basin. And many of us are excited by that because we consider that region to be the history book of the early solar system, holding the secrets of the bombardment history that shaped the Earth and also during that time period led to the first formation of life on our planet. So lastly, a sustainable lunar program must include humans on the surface. As the Vice President said, by the middle of this decade, by 2024, not the end of the decade as we've heard about previously. Today, we can do rapid prototyping and development of a human lander that reuses systems and technology from origin, from the Orion, the Curiosity, and the Mars InSight lander. Let's make sure we are taking advantage of that. Finally, if this strategic vision for lunar development is to succeed, we must change our tolerance for risk. And that's not just the agency, that's also the Congress and the American public. This will require a culture change where failure is not a fault, but rather an opportunity to learn and to improve. Equally important is stability. Stability of national leadership, stability of our goals for the space program, where long-term targets and proper funding are maintained, giving us all the best opportunity to succeed. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Professor. Well done. Well done. With that, let me recognize our next panelist and get to my questions. Dan Dumbacher, the Executive Director of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Dan, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Members of the National Space Council, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. To achieve the objectives of SPD-1, we must move deliberately and expeditiously. It is a priority for our nation, and that has been demonstrated today. The United States must remain the leader and drive the evolution of the rules of the road as we progress further into space. Let us not forget that it was the United States that led the development of commercial and military aircraft, establishing and sustaining the aviation marketplace of today. Our challenge for all stakeholders in the executive branch, Congress, NASA, and industry is to assess and accept the risk to accomplish our difficult goals. It is absolutely proper that we should learn from the mistakes and failures of the past. However, we cannot allow the scar tissue to bind us up to the point of being unable to achieve progress. We know and have demonstrated that the benefit of exploration is worth the risk. Based on my experience, I would like to summarize 5 actionable and crucial suggestions. Number 1, the strategy, objectives, and necessary funding must be closely coordinated across the executive and legislative branches. Constant debate over budgets, approaches, goals, and program plans impede progress and adds unnecessary risk to an already challenging effort. 2, NASA should allow program and project managers with the essential input of technical and safety stakeholders to accept more risk and make decisions more quickly. The team must be allowed to assess opportunities and risks, be bold in pursuing the beneficial opportunities, and manage the risk toward achieving the program goals. 3, there needs to be clear accountability to the top of the agency for the development of the systems and technologies needed for NASA's important activities. This team should have direct access to agency leadership and timely access to external stakeholders. 4, it is essential that the bureaucracy be held accountable to support the programs and strategy and not impede progress. The team executing the program should obviously be held accountable to achieve the plan, and the team should be allowed to work with minimal interference. 5, transparency and trust are essential and must be established for the long term. Exploration and resulting economic opportunities require all stakeholders at the table. By regularly convening stakeholders from across industry, academia, and government for frequent communication, problems can be anticipated early and potential solutions can be identified. It is time for us to extend the human neighborhood, first to the moon in 2024 and then beyond. The United States must lead. We must act quickly, decisively, purposefully to maintain this leadership. I am confident that we are up to the challenge. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address the National Space Council. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. Well done. that, Wanda Sigger, who brings a nearly 40-year career at Lockheed Martin, has just been at the center of the American space enterprise for decades. Thank you for being here today, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, distinguished members of the Cabinet, and members of the National Space Council, I'm honored to address you today. 5 American flags stand on the moon today. Reminders of what's possible. They're seen by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. We were all children of the Apollo missions. We grew up with a challenge. If we can put a man on the moon, well, why can't you? And it's, well, why can't you do anything that you can imagine? Apollo energized a generation, not just in the United States, but around the world. Everyone wants to play in exploration, and they are. If America is to lead the human exploration endeavor, the pace of accomplishment is important. Over the last few years, NASA and their contractor community have accomplished amazing things. The energy in the space startup community is palpable. Much of it's driven by NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Services contract and other contracts that use public-private partnerships. I'm aware of several new startups. They're bringing venture capital funding into exploration. All of this is driven by these new opportunities. In support of today's challenge, I have seen recent studies that re-examine the human exploration architecture with a view towards acceleration without sacrificing safety or major functionality. And of course, the specifics will be arguable, but the logic is consistent. Re-examine acceptable risk, balance execution and safety. Leverage existing systems and develop only what is critical while shedding unnecessary changes and upgrades. Leverage simpler and optimized ground testing. Public-private partnerships as a basis for enabling reduced public investment are a proven methodology, but nonetheless, success will require significant funding, management, and careful planning. Our terrestrial experiences with successful public-private partnerships serve as a model for exploration. And certainly NASA's public-private partnerships have had a history of success in technology development, but incentivizing the end markets of commercialization should also be considered as a tool for acceleration. Examples include providing data on guaranteed government-procured services. For example, advertising procured oxygen, both price and quantity, or perhaps fuel, or bandwidth, or imagery, or data analytics. They're all incentives that might be used to fuel business cases. In closing, I look forward to the day when landers, habitats, and commercial rovers will join the 5 standing American flags on the moon. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Secretary Ross for the opening question, but let me thank Professor Burns. Thank you for your call for adequate resources. It is an admonition, and I hope you've gotten a sense that we get that, we understand that. I want the people here at Marshall to understand that this president, this administration is determined to work with the leaders in Congress to make sure we have the resources to support the objectives. And Dan, thank you for that eloquent comment about not allowing the scar tissue of the past to bind up our progress. That is a powerful statement. But let me direct my question to Wanda, if I can. I'm very intrigued. You said you've been involved in this for a while. You're watching venture capital now flowing into commercial space enterprise. And by the way, I think 5 American flags would be a great title of a book.
Yes.
Yeah. It's time for the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th American flag to be on the moon. It's very eloquent. It's very eloquent. You said the pace of accomplishment is important. And the president has set out a very clear goal for putting an American astronaut back on the moon within the next 5 years. Can you unpack that a little bit for the council? Because it seemed to me you were affirming the need for us to be moving out and moving rapidly.
Yes, sir, Mr. Vice President. Absolutely. I am foot stomping the president's mandate for boots on the moon by 2024. I've seen studies that show it's possible to put a lander by 2022 and then move forward with a certain pace to support accelerated landing. Unpacking it would require probably many of the steps that NASA is already undertaking and looking at the execution milestones that exist, but some of the things that might be considered would be perhaps an early lunar gateway. That was considered to be something that, first of all, the gateway is absolutely required. The Space Launch System is absolutely required, but how we execute and what we consider to be mandatory elements of that program could probably stand a bit more re-examination. An evaluation of the total critical path of the tasks to figure what's absolutely required for that 5 or 6 year target, breaking down and assessing what are some of the key elements that will be built and used will be part of a story that allows for success. There is a potential to reuse some of the designs that are perhaps associated with things that we've already demonstrated. The lunar lander could look very similar to what we've already demonstrated with InSight on Mars, for example, using the propulsion, the PPE, the propulsion element that's going to be built by NASA could be part of an overall landing configuration, for example. There are means for us to reuse what is already in our arsenal, both knowledge and hardware.
Great. That's a great answer. Maybe, Jim, we could get her to write that up once we get the transcript. But just some very inspiring words. Let me go to Secretary Ross, and we'll be very sensitive to time here for everyone looking on. We're going to move through a couple questions real quickly, do recommendations, and we'll wrap up. Wilbur?
Thank you. I'm fascinated at the idea of the moon as a refueling station. So I'm curious, Dr. Burns, about what's the theoretical approach to taking ice at absolute 0 plus 40 and making it either into water or breaking it down into the hydrogen and oxygen?
That's a great question, Secretary Ross, and a lot about that we don't understand. First of all, we don't understand what the water ice looks like below the surface. Is it mixed finely with the, as it's called, lunar regolith, or is it in blocks of ice? Both are theoretically possible, but they would require very different techniques to be able to extract. That's number one. Number two is the way we make rocket fuel today on the ground is not from water. And so what we're talking about is a fundamentally different approach. So indeed, there's a lot of excitement about the potential, particularly economic potential, for developing fuel mined from the moon, but there's much we need to understand first. And so that's why, as I was saying a few minutes ago, we need to begin quickly with a robotic mission to understand the nature of that water ice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Jim, they brought up budgeting. Your comments or questions for the panel from Office of Management and Budget?
Commercialization has been mentioned several times by the panelists, by remarks, members of the Space Council. Could you give me an idea on where you see the next big opportunity for commercialization and partnerships in space?
I think the next big opportunities from my perspective, this is a personal opinion, is going to be in helping with the logistics train that follow, that as we move and extend out, there are services required in terms of transportation and operations that can be fulfilled by the commercial private enterprise system, and we ought to allow that to happen. And we ought to, as we look at how we approach this and move further out, we ought to look for those opportunities that we can make and get commercial private enterprise to participate in that we haven't even thought of at this point.
An answer I would offer seems to be one that's already being demonstrated by NASA. The CLIPS program, as I mentioned earlier, was one that spoke to a capability for a number of folks in the commercial arenas to pull together solutions for small landers. the acceleration of procurement activities seems to be just as energizing as the opportunity to play. So a continuation with perhaps opportunities to bid on, certainly human landers are out there now, but medium-sized landers. All of the hardware that has some potential for a potential seat on the moon should be announced as soon as possible, with opportunities for people with varied ideas and solutions to perhaps, if not develop a bid on their own, form consortiums in order to provide a solution.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Administrator Bridenstine.
Yes, sir, Mr. Vice President. Can you hear me? Okay, good. A couple of things, I guess, for Dan Dunbacher to start. You're a program manager historically for NASA. Your reputation is exceptional in that area. Could you share with us kind of how a large project has a spending cycle, and ultimately how multi-year appropriations or more than 2-year appropriations could be helpful? And I say this because the Vice President in his speech earlier, he said, by any means necessary. And to me, that means some of the capabilities that are within the Department of Defense we need to consider bringing into NASA. And so if you could just talk for a second about the spending flows for a large project and how multi-year procurement or multi-year appropriations could be helpful.
I would be more than happy to answer this question. I have long sought the answer for this. During the typical program life cycle, you have the early requirements, concept development, engineering, and as you proceed into full-scale detailed design, the workforce increases, the hardware increases, therefore the cost increases, and then as you get into test, then it tails off. The challenge on these major programs is that when you are dealing with annual appropriation cycles, you get into annual replans, constant planning, constant replanning, particularly as you get into continuing resolutions and all those kinds of fun things. And the point here is that with opportunities that and other models that exist that provide funding, like was done for the Endeavour Orbiter as we came out of Columbia, or came out of Challenger, was the agency was provided the funding to go execute that orbiter. We called it no-year funding. And then we were allowed to go execute. And the program management was allowed to make the trades they needed to make. They were allowed to, they gave them some margin, both in terms of timing and in terms of funding availability to go do what they needed to go do. That kind of model would be extremely helpful for program managers. It would allow us to put a plan in place, get the right buy-off on the plan, and then execute the plan. And that would be extremely beneficial and make it much less risky, frankly. It'll take some of the risk out of the equation and allows a higher probability of success on achieving the program goals.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yes, sir. Dr. Burns, one thing that I think is important, we've learned painful lessons in history. One of those lessons is, and I say this because I know Jim Hers is here and I want you to hear this. One of the lessons is when we have a big objective that we're trying to achieve, and in order to achieve it, we cannibalize other parts of the agency, namely the Science Mission Directorate, in order to achieve the exploration agenda, it doesn't work out. Can you share with us kind of the challenge with that activity?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because this is a very sensitive issue among my science colleagues, that I'm often asked about the balance between the human program and the science program. And we like to think about, in moving forward now, particularly to the moon, that there is a synergy between those two that we haven't experienced before. Because in order to explore the moon, you also have to bring scientists, you have to bring a science agenda. But in the past, when funds have been reallocated from science to exploration, and they have happened a few times in the past, it's been devastating. We look at the decadal survey in astrophysics, planetary science, and earth science, and heliophysics as really our guide to what we want to do. And so in the last decade, for example, we've not been able to execute much of what was in the decadal survey. The James Webb Space Telescope, which is getting close to launch, is well over budget from what was originally planned and over time. And a number of other things, more modest things, have not been made available. So among the things that our science colleagues are doing is this next set of decadal surveys is, are there more modest, fewer flagships and more individual missions that we can do that will advance the science without busting the budget? So we're looking at a variety of things that will help to budgetarily as well as exploration-wise to advance both science and exploration moving outward.
Thank you, Dr. Burns. I just wanted to highlight that when we cannibalize science for human exploration, it becomes very partisan in the House and in the Senate, and then none of us get to achieve the objectives that we're trying to ultimately achieve on any side of the aisle. And I want to make sure that we're very sensitive to that. Last thing is, Wanda, there's one sentence in here, and I'm going to read this for the NASA workforce and our industry partners that are here. And the sentence that you said, I think, is tremendously valuable. Anything that is not mandatory is a distraction. Those words could not be more true. And of course, on the next page, you gave 7 bullet points of items that we need to achieve. I'm not going to go into those, but I'm probably going to post that on the NASA website and email it out to everybody at the NASA workforce, because we now have a directive to try to meet 2024, and that's the only way we're going to be able to achieve it. So thank you for that testimony, Wanda. Mr. Vice President, I yield back.
Just outstanding. Would you all join me in thanking this outstanding panel? Great job. Thank you. With that, let me direct members of the National Space Council to recommendations on human space exploration that are in your folder. They reflect the President's stated objective of returning American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years, and also a variety of reforms, all of which have been discussed today in presentations and in recommendations from our user advisory group. There's also recommendations about industry, space-related export controls, regulatory and policy actions, all of which have been developed. If there is any discussion, the chair would recognize any discussion from any of the members. I know you've had the opportunity to review these recommendations. Hearing no objection, we will forward these recommendations to the President from the National Space Council on a unanimous basis. Correct? Thank you. Very good. Let me simply close by thanking all those present, thanking the extraordinary contributions of our panelists, members of the User Advisory Group, and frankly, all of the extraordinary men and women here at Marshall Space Flight Center. It's an honor to have been with you all. Governor Ivey, thank you so much for your presence throughout this. I think it reflects not only your personal commitment to the space program, but the relationship of Huntsville and Alabama to the American space enterprise. It is, as I close, let me just remind you for what we've already heard. We will celebrate in many ways over the course of this year that one giant leap for mankind that happened 50 years ago. But as I said earlier, it's time for the next giant leap. And that next giant leap is to return American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years, by any means necessary, to establish a permanent presence on the moon and prepare to put American astronauts on Mars. This is the stated objective of the United States of America and the direction of the President of the United States. And I can assure you that we will bring the full resources of this administration and the federal government behind this effort. It is a national priority, and so it will remain. But to accomplish this, as we've said before, and I say with the deepest respect and admiration for the men and women of NASA, for the Marshall Space Flight Center, for the incredible legacy of leadership and innovation here, that it's time to step up. It's time to redouble our efforts, accelerate, as you've heard today, the SLS program to meet this objective. It can happen, but it will not happen unless we increase the pace of innovation and change. We are a nation of restless pioneers. We are led by a president who believes in going higher, farther, faster than ever before, and is determined to make sure that we renew American leadership in space, and particularly America's commitment to human space exploration. I leave you with the administrator's admonition: focus on the mission over the means. Don't let anything stand in the way. And with sincere thanks to all who participated here, I will end this meeting the way that President Trump often ends meeting in the Oval Office on important matters. When everything is talked about, he looks around the room and says, "Let's go." So let's go, NASA. Yes. Let's go, American space. Let's go back to the moon. Thank you all, and God bless you.